Deep in the Hurtgen forest, two hikers stepped off the marked trail, looking for a shortcut back to their car. The ground beneath their boots felt wrong, hollow. One of them kicked through the leaves and hit something solid, concrete. They scraped away decades of dirt moss and tangled roots and found a hatch. Rusted shut, half swallowed by the earth like the forest had been trying to bury it for good. It took both of them 20 minutes to pry it open. The smell hit first. Stale air, damp stone, and something else, something old, like a room that hadn't breathed in a lifetime. One of them pulled out his phone and pointed the flashlight down into the darkness. A narrow set of concrete stairs disappeared below. They climbed down. What they found made them stop talking. A bunker, fully intact. Maps pinned to the walls, yellowed and curling at the edges. A radio set covered in dust. Canned food stacked neatly on a shelf, labels faded beyond reading. A chair sat in the corner, and draped over its back was a military uniform. Wehrmacht, officer's rank. On the collar, the insignia of a general. There were personal effects scattered across a small desk, a journal, letters never sent, photographs of a woman and two children. And in the far corner, partially hidden beneath a wool blanket, what appeared to be human remains. No one had been inside this bunker for decades, maybe longer. The hikers backed out, called the police, and within 48 hours the Hurtgen forest was crawling with investigators, forensic teams, and military historians, all asking the same questions. Who was this man? Why did he come here? And how did an entire forest keep his secret for 80 years? To understand how a general vanishes, you first have to understand what Germany looked like in the spring of 1945. It was a country eating itself alive. By April, the Third Reich existed more on paper than in reality. Allied forces were pouring across the Rhine from the West Americans, British Canadians, pushing deeper into German territory every single day. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was cutting through Poland and closing in on Berlin with a fury that terrified even hardened Wehrmacht veterans. The soldiers knew what was coming. Many had already stopped fighting. Entire units were surrendering en masse, throwing down their weapons and walking toward Allied lines with their hands up, praying they'd be taken by the Americans or British and not the Soviets. But for the officers, especially the senior ones, surrender wasn't that simple. These were men whose names appeared on documents, orders they had signed, camps they had overseen, operations they had authorized. The Allies weren't just coming to win a war, they were coming with lists, names of men who would be hunted, tried, and in many cases executed. Nuremberg was already being whispered about in the corridors of power. So while privates and corporals dropped their rifles and walked into captivity, generals and colonels faced a different calculation. Surrender meant interrogation. Interrogation meant exposure. Exposure meant a noose. Some chose to face it. Others put pistols to their own heads, and a few simply disappeared. They burned their papers, changed into civilian clothes, slipped into the rivers of refugees flooding every road in Germany, and vanished into the chaos. One of those men was a general whose name had been on every Allied intelligence list since 1944. A man who chose none of those options. He didn't run south. He didn't flee to Argentina. He walked straight into the forest and never came out. His name was Friedrich Eckhardt, General Lieutenant, 2 stars, born in 1,898 inches. Heidelberg, to a family that had produced military officers for 3 generations. His father served in the First World War. His grandfather fought in the Franco-Prussian War. Friedrich never questioned what he would become. He entered the Reichswehr as a young officer in the 1920s, sharp, disciplined, and quietly ambitious. By the time the Wehrmacht expanded under Hitler's rearmament program, Eckhardt had already proven himself a capable tactician. He commanded infantry units during the invasion of France in 1940 and earned a reputation as an officer who kept his men alive. Soldiers trusted him, subordinates respected him, superiors promoted him. By 1942, he was on the Eastern Front, commanding a division during some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. Stalingrad, Kursk, the long, grinding retreat westward through Ukraine and Poland. Eckhart survived all of it. But survival on the Eastern Front came at a cost. Orders came down from Berlin that had nothing to do with military strategy. Villages to be cleared, partisan reprisals to be carried out, populations to be relocated. The language was always clinical, but everyone knew what it meant. Later after the war, survivors from his division would tell conflicting stories. Some said Eckhart carried out every order without hesitation. Others claimed he quietly delayed or redirected certain directives, saving lives without ever openly defying command. The truth probably lived somewhere in the middle. A man who followed enough orders to keep his rank and looked away from enough horrors to keep his sanity. By late 1944, Eckhart had been transferred to the Western Front, assigned to defend a stretch of the Rhineland that everyone knew was indefensible. He was 46 years old, tired, and carrying the weight of decisions that no medal could justify. April 3, 1945. Eckhart's division was barely a division anymore. Half his men were dead, wounded, or missing. The rest were boys and old men conscripted in the final desperate months of the war. They were dug in along a crumbling defensive line west of the Rhine, with American artillery shelling their positions around the clock. That morning, a courier arrived on a motorcycle carrying sealed orders from Berlin. Eckhart read them alone in what was left of his command post. The details of those orders have never been fully confirmed, but fragments recovered decades later from Wehrmacht communication logs paint a grim picture. Scorched earth. Destroy all infrastructure, bridges, factories, rail lines. Leave nothing for the advancing Allies. And there was a second directive. Liquidate prisoners being held at a nearby labor camp before Allied forces could liberate them. Burn the records. Erase the evidence. Eckhart's adjutant, Captain Werner Falk, was the last officer to speak with him that evening. In a statement given to American interrogators months later, Falk described a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He said the general sat at his desk staring at the orders for a long time without speaking. Then he folded the papers, put them in his breast pocket, and said something Falk never forgot. "There's nothing left worth following." The next morning, April 4th, Eckhart was gone. His staff car was still parked outside the command post. His sidearm was on his desk. His personal effects, maps, journals, photographs were missing. No one saw him leave. No one heard a vehicle. The prisoners at the labor camp were liberated by American forces 2 days later alive. The bridges were never blown. Whatever Eckhart decided to do with those orders, he didn't carry them out. But he also didn't surrender. He simply walked into the night and vanished. For the next 48 hours, nobody even noticed he was gone. The front was collapsing so fast that entire regiments were dissolving overnight. Officers abandoned their posts. Communication lines went dead. Units that had fought together for years scattered like dust in the wind. Eckhart's absence was just one more gap in a chain of command that had already shattered. Captain Falk assumed the general had been killed during an artillery barrage or captured while attempting to reach another unit. He reported Eckhart as missing and moved what was left of the division east, trying to surrender to the Americans before the Soviets reached them. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, Friedrich Eckhart's name appeared on a Wehrmacht casualty list. Status missing, presumed dead, no body recovered, no grave, no witnesses to his death. Allied intelligence teams spent the following months processing thousands of captured German officers. Eckhart's name was on their lists. He was wanted for questioning about operations on the Eastern Front and the final weeks of fighting in the Rhineland, but he never appeared. Not in American prisoner of war camps, Not in British detention facilities. Not in Soviet captivity records which were opened decades later. His name was checked against passenger manifests for ships leaving Europe, against border-crossing records in Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, against known ratline networks that smuggled former Nazis to South America. Nothing. In the chaos of post-war Europe, 8 million displaced persons were wandering the continent. Refugees from every country, former soldiers in civilian clothes, families separated by years of bombing and occupation. People disappeared every day. They changed their names. They crossed borders on foot. They buried their uniforms in fields and started new lives in new cities. One missing general among millions of missing people. Nobody was looking very hard. In Heidelberg, Eckhart's wife Margaretha waited. She had last received a letter from Friedrich in March 1945, a short note written in haste. He told her to stay with her sister. He told her not to travel east under any circumstances. He told her he loved the children. He didn't say goodbye, but she read it like one anyway. When the Americans occupied Heidelberg in late March, Margrethe and her 2 children, Katrine, age 12, and Hans, age 8, were living in her sister's apartment, surviving on rations and rumors. American intelligence officers came to the door twice. They wanted to know where her husband was. She told them the truth. She didn't know. They searched the apartment, took letters, took photographs, asked questions about Friedrich's service record, his political affiliations, his friends. Margrethe answered everything because she had nothing to hide and nowhere to turn. The interrogators left unsatisfied. They didn't believe a general's wife knew nothing, but they couldn't prove otherwise. In the months that followed, Margaretha wrote letters to every authority she could find. The Red Cross, the American military government, the new German provisional authorities. She asked the same question over and over. Is my husband alive? Is he a prisoner? Can you tell me where he is? The answers were always the same. No information available. By 1947, she had stopped writing. Friedrich was officially declared dead in 1950 under German law, which allowed families of missing soldiers to obtain death certificates after 5 years without contact. Margaretha held a small memorial service. No casket, no body, just a photograph on a table and 2 children who would grow up knowing their father only through stories. Katrin accepted it. She mourned and moved forward. But Hans never did. Even as a boy, he kept asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. Where did he go? Why didn't they find him? What was he running from? Those questions would follow Hans Eckhart for the rest of his life, and eventually they would lead him straight back into that forest. Over the next 4 decades, Friedrich Eckhart's name drifted through the murky waters of Cold War intelligence like a ghost that wouldn't stay buried. In 1951, a British denazification officer flagged his file during a routine review of unresolved cases. The note was brief. General Lieutenant Eckhart wanted for questioning. Eastern Front Operations, 1942 to 1944. Status unresolved, no action taken. The file was closed and shelved. Then, in 1958, a former Wehrmacht colonel living in Argentina under a false name was arrested by Israeli intelligence agents hunting Nazi war criminals. During interrogation, he mentioned Eckhart by name, claiming the general had been part of a network of officers who planned their disappearances months before the war ended. He said Eckhart had contacts in Switzerland and access to funds hidden in a Zurich bank. Israeli and German investigators followed the lead. The bank existed. The account did not. Another dead end. In 1971, when the Soviet Union began allowing limited access to its prisoner of war archives, a German research team cross-referenced thousands of names against Wehrmacht missing persons records. Eckhart's name appeared on a provisional list of German officers allegedly held in Camp 7150 near Vorkuta in the Soviet Arctic. But when the full records were examined years later, His name wasn't there. It had been a clerical error or a deliberate falsification. No one could determine which. Conspiracy theories multiplied with every decade. Eckhart was living in Paraguay under an assumed name. Eckhart had been recruited by Soviet intelligence. Eckhart had been executed by his own men and buried in a roadside ditch. Online forums dedicated to unsolved military disappearances kept his name circulating. Amateur researchers argued endlessly about what had happened. But nobody had proof of anything. Friedrich Eckhart had stepped out of history. On April 4th, 1945, and history had simply closed behind him. Hans Eckhart never stopped looking. As a young man in the 1960s, he began writing letters to military archives in Germany, Britain, and the United States. He requested his father's service records, filed Freedom of Information requests, visited former Wehrmacht officers in nursing homes, and asked them what they remembered about General Lieutenant Eckhart. Most remembered the name. Few remembered the man. And none of them knew where he had gone. By the time Hans was in his 50s, he had assembled a personal archive that filled an entire room in his Heidelberg apartment. Folders organized by year. Maps of his father's last known positions, photocopies of intelligence documents obtained through decades of patient bureaucratic persistence. His wife called it an obsession. His sister Katrin called it a wound that refused to heal. She wasn't wrong, but Hans wasn't alone. In 2003, a journalist named Petra Vogel published an article in Der Spiegel about unresolved Wehrmacht disappearances. Eckhart's case was mentioned in a single paragraph. Hans contacted her immediately. Petra had her own reasons for pursuing the story. Her grandfather had served in the same division as Eckhart and had spent his final years haunted by things he refused to talk about. She wanted to understand what had happened on that front, what orders had been given, what had been done. Together they began a systematic investigation that went far beyond what Hans had been able to accomplish alone. Petra had access to newly declassified archives in Berlin and Moscow. She interviewed historians who specialized in the final months of the war. She tracked down Captain Werner Falk's interrogation transcript in an American military archive in Maryland. That transcript contained the last known words Friedrich Eckhart ever spoke. "There's nothing left worth following." But even with all of this, they couldn't answer the only question that mattered. Where did he go? The Hurtgen Forest sits along the German-Belgian border, roughly 20 miles south of Aachen. It covers nearly 130 square kilometers of dense, ancient woodland. Tall spruce and pine packed so tightly together that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor in summer. In winter, the canopy holds the darkness like a ceiling. Locals have a saying about the Hurtgen. The forest remembers what people try to forget. And the Hurtgen has plenty to remember. In the autumn of 1944, American and German forces fought one of the bloodiest and most pointless battles of the entire war right here among these trees. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest lasted 5 months. Over 33,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded. German casualties were comparable. The forest was shredded by artillery. Entire hillsides stripped of trees. Craters so deep they filled with rainwater and became permanent ponds. 80 years later, the scars are still there if you know where to look. Hikers occasionally stumble across shell casings, rusted helmets, and fragments of equipment poking through the forest floor. Every few years, a construction crew or forestry team uncovers unexploded ordnance. Bomb disposal units are called so regularly that locals barely notice anymore. But beneath the surface, the Hurtgen holds older secrets. Both sides built bunkers during the battle. German positions were dug deep into the hillsides, reinforced with concrete, and designed to withstand sustained bombardment. After the war, many were sealed or simply forgotten. The forest grew over them. Roots cracked through concrete, soil buried entrances, entire structures disappeared beneath decades of fallen leaves and undergrowth. During the Cold War, portions of the forest near the Belgian border were restricted. NATO exercises were conducted in the area, and certain zones were off-limits to civilians for years at a time. By the time those restrictions were lifted in the 1990s, the forest had been left alone long enough to swallow almost everything that had been built inside it. Almost everything. October 14, 2025. Two urban explorers from Cologne named Marcus Brandt and Yusuf Demir had spent the morning hiking through a remote section of the Hurtgen looking for remnants of wartime fortifications. They'd done this before. Found old foxholes, collapsed trenches, the usual stuff that history tourists photograph and post online. But around noon, roughly 3 kilometers off the nearest marked trail, Marcus felt the ground shift under his boot, not soft like mud, hollow. He stopped and stamped his foot. The sound came back wrong. A dull metallic echo like something was underneath. They got on their knees and started clearing away leaves, dirt, and a thick mat of roots. It took 20 minutes before they hit concrete. A hatch. Rectangular. Maybe 80 centimeters across. The hinges were rusted almost solid, but the frame was intact. Whoever built this had built it to last. Yusuf wedged a hiking pole into the seam, and they pried it open together. The seal broke with a sound like a gasp. Air rushed out damp and stale, carrying a smell that neither of them could identify. Not rot, exactly. More like old paper and cold stone and something faintly chemical. Marcus pointed his phone flashlight into the opening. Concrete stairs, narrow, descending maybe 4 meters into total darkness. They looked at each other and went down. The bunker was small. One main room roughly 3 meters by 4. A second smaller space off to the side, barely large enough to lie down in. But it was what filled those rooms that made them both go silent. A Wehrmacht uniform hung over the back of a wooden chair. Officers' insignia still visible on the collar. Maps were pinned to the walls covered in handwritten annotations. A radio set sat on a shelf next to rows of canned food labels long faded to nothing. On a small desk sat a leather journal, a stack of unsealed letters, and a photograph of a woman with 2 young children. And in the smaller room, partially covered by a wool blanket, lay what was unmistakably a human skeleton. Marcus and Yusuf backed up the stairs into the daylight and called the police. Within hours, the Hurtgen forest was sealed off. Whatever this place was, whoever this man had been, the forest had finally decided to give him back. By the following morning, the site looked like a crime scene from a different century. Police tape stretched between trees. Forensic technicians in white suits moved carefully down the concrete stairs carrying evidence bags and portable lighting rigs. A generator hummed somewhere above ground, powering floodlights that illuminated the bunker for the first time in decades. Every item was photographed in place before being touched. Every surface was dusted. Every inch of the floor was examined. The process would take 11 days. Dr. Lena Fassbinder, a forensic archaeologist from the University of Cologne, led the recovery of the remains. The skeleton was largely intact, positioned on its side on a narrow cot in the smaller room. The wool blanket covering it had partially disintegrated, but enough remained to suggest the man had lain down deliberately. There were no signs of trauma on the bones, no bullet wounds, no fractures. Whoever this was had not died violently. He had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Military historians from the Bundeswehr Center of Military History arrived on day 3. The uniform was examined first. General Lieutenant. The insignia matched Wehrmacht officer rankings from 1944 to 1945. The maps pinned to the walls showed defensive positions along the Rhine, consistent with German operations in the final months of the war. Handwritten notes in the margins referenced unit designations, supply lines, and withdrawal routes. But it was the journal that changed everything. 146 pages written in a precise, disciplined hand. The first entry was dated April 5th, 1945. The last was dated November 22nd, 1945. 7 months of entries. DNA was extracted from the remains and cross-referenced against a sample provided by a living relative. Hans Eckhart, now 88 years old, received a phone call in Heidelberg on November 9, 2025. The voice on the other end told him what he had spent his entire life trying to learn. They had found his father. The journal told a story no one had anticipated. Friedrich Eckhart hadn't stumbled into the Hurtgen forest in a panic. He had planned this. The earliest entries described preparations made weeks before his disappearance. He had identified the bunker during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest in late 1944, when his division briefly held positions in the area. It was a German communications post abandoned after an artillery strike collapsed part of the entrance. Eckhart noted its location and returned to it months later, carrying supplies he had stockpiled from military stores. Canned rations, water purification tablets, blankets, a medical kit, a radio he never intended to use for communication but kept to monitor Allied broadcasts. He wasn't running blindly. He was building a tomb. The entries from April and May 1945 were clinical, almost detached. He described hearing artillery in the distance, growing fainter, as the front moved east. He recorded the date he heard Germany's surrender announced on the radio, May 8th. He wrote a single line, "It is finished. None of it was worth what it cost." Through the summer months, the entries shifted. Less about survival, more about memory. He wrote about the Eastern Front, about orders he had carried out and orders he had quietly sabotaged. He described villages he had seen burned, prisoners he could not protect, decisions that kept him alive and kept him complicit. He never used the word guilt directly, but it saturated every page. By autumn, the entries grew shorter, more fragmented. He wrote about his children frequently. Katrin, learning to read. Hans, chasing pigeons in the garden in Heidelberg. He wrote to Margarete in letters he never sent, telling her things he said he could never speak aloud. The final entry on November 22nd was brief. "The cold is inside now. I have made my choices. I do not ask for forgiveness because I would not grant it to myself. The forest is patient. I will be too." The supplies in the bunker suggested he had planned for approximately 8 months. He made it to 7. Friedrich Eckhart didn't die because he was lost. He died because he stayed. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.